In the year 1842, the humid air hung thick in the village of Nkamba as the foreign men arrived. Their pale skin glistened with sweat, and their boots sank into the soft earth. The leader, Captain Edward Hollister, stood tall, his blue eyes scanning the faces of the villagers with a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. Behind him, his team, 4 men with rifles slung across their backs, waited impatiently. Chief Imbuta, an old man with deep wrinkles and knowing eyes, stepped forward. He did not welcome them. Instead, he raised his hand and spoke in a grave voice. "The forest ahead is not for men like you. It is alive. It swallows those who do not belong." Hollister chuckled, brushing off the warning. "We've faced dangers before, old man. We are here for knowledge, for discovery." Imbuta's expression did not change. "Then you have already dug your graves." He turned and walked away, the villagers lowering their eyes in silence. That night, as the explorers set up camp at the edge of the forbidden jungle, they heard whispers in the wind, voices speaking in a language none of them knew. One of the men, Clark, claimed he saw figures moving between the trees, tall, shadow-like beings with glowing eyes. But Hollister laughed at his fear and ordered everyone to sleep. The jungle, however, did not sleep. At dawn, the explorers crossed into the Congo Basin, machetes slicing through vines and hanging roots. The forest seemed to breathe, its canopy thick, its silence unnatural. Birds chirped in distant bursts, then stopped all at once, as if silenced by an unseen presence. Hollister led the way, map in hand, unaware that the paths drawn on paper were no match for what lived in the shadows. The deeper they went, the more strange things became. Compasses spun wildly. The sun, though it rose, never quite reached the ground. An eerie green glow settled over everything, and the air smelled not just of moss and damp earth, but of rot and blood. The men grew uneasy, especially when they stumbled upon an ancient stone totem buried in roots. The figure carved into it had no face, just a mouth wide open, swallowing tiny human figures. Clark wanted to turn back. "Something's wrong here," he whispered. "We should have listened to the chief." But Hollister, driven by pride and ambition, insisted they press on. That night, their campfire barely lit the clearing they settled in. Strange sounds circled them. Crackling leaves, faint singing, low growls that came from no animal they knew. At midnight, McGregor, the youngest explorer, vanished from his tent. No scream, no struggle, just gone. In his place, they found a trail of wet footprints leading back into the darkness, bare feet, but far too large to be human. Panic set in, but Hollister forced them to stay, convinced McGregor had wandered off. They searched until morning, calling his name, finding nothing but torn branches and fresh claw marks on the trees. The forest had taken its first bite, and it wasn't done. By the 3rd day, the forest had changed. The trail they marked on their way in was gone, erased as if the jungle had healed itself overnight. Clark tied red cloth to the trees as they moved, but the cloths vanished within hours. The men whispered now, afraid to speak too loudly, as if the forest could hear them. Their supplies were dwindling, and Hollister's leadership began to crack. He barked orders, but his eyes twitched with fear. The men were growing restless, and afraid of the silence that seemed to follow them, as if the jungle were holding its breath. On the 4th night, they heard chanting, faint, melodic, not human. They found Johnston the next morning, half buried in a mound of leaves, eyes open, mouth stuffed with moss. His body was bone-thin, like he had been dead for weeks, not hours. Something had drained him of time, of life. Clark wept quietly, while Morgan, the team's hunter, loaded his rifle and refused to put it down. "We are being watched," Morgan said, scanning the trees. "And whatever's out there, it's playing with us." That evening, they tried to build a signal fire, but the wood wouldn't catch. The flame died before it could grow, smothered by unseen wind. And then, one by one, the men's names were whispered from the trees, first softly, then louder, in perfect English. Clark dropped to his knees and begged Hollister to turn back. "We are not welcome here," he cried. The chief was right. This place, it's alive. But there was no turning back. Every direction looked the same, and as darkness fell, the forest smiled. The jungle had stopped pretending. Now it hunted openly. No longer were the shadows subtle, the sounds faint. There were footsteps in the underbrush. Heavy, wet, deliberate. Shapes moved just beyond the edge of vision. Long-limbed, gliding between trees like smoke. The air grew colder, impossibly so for a rainforest, and the smell of decay clung to every breath. Morgan had enough. "If we die fighting," he said, planting himself beside a massive tree. He set traps, wire, trip lines, sharpened sticks, and vowed to stay alert till morning. Hollister, exhausted and hollow-eyed, had stopped resisting. He sat beside the cold ashes of their last fire, scribbling in his journal, muttering, "It's watching us write our own eulogy." That night, the forest attacked. It began with a scream, Clark's. They rushed to his tent, only to find blood, torn fabric, and drag marks into the trees. Morgan fired his rifle blindly, the gunshots echoing like thunder. Silence followed. Then came laughter, childlike and echoing, but twisted, like broken music boxes. One by one, the traps Morgan set were triggered, not by animals, by things that didn't bleed, didn't cry out, didn't die. A creature emerged briefly from the darkness. Taller than a man, wrapped in bark and flesh, eyes glowing with hunger. Morgan shot it square in the chest. It paused, tilted its head, then melted back into the trees. Morgan was never seen again. By dawn, only Hollister remained. He walked in circles, delirious, journal clutched to his chest. The forest had silenced itself again, as if digesting. Hollister didn't know which way was out, if there was an out, but he kept walking, blind with terror and guilt, hoping that if he offered himself, the forest would let him leave. It wouldn't. Years later, a man was found wandering the outskirts of Nkamba village. His skin clung to his bones, his hair was tangled with leaves, and his eyes, once a sharp blue, were now milky white. He was blind. Chief Imbuta, older but still wise, stood before him. "You have returned," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. The man, Hollister, collapsed at the chief's feet, clutching a tattered journal. His voice was weak, cracked, barely a whisper. "It eats men whole." The villagers carried him into a hut, nursing him back to life, but he would never be the same. He spoke in fragments, his mind lost in the endless green. He muttered of trees that moved when no one was looking, of faces appearing in the bark, of whispers that dug into his skull and would not leave. No one asked how he survived. No one dared. One night, as he lay staring at the thatched roof, he reached for Chief Imbuta's hand. "I never found the way out," he whispered. "The forest let me go." The chief frowned. "Then why do you look so afraid?" Hollister's lips trembled. "Because it's still inside me." A week later, he vanished. No footprints, no signs of struggle, just his journal left behind. Pages filled with frantic scrawls of trees with hungry mouths and hollow eyes. The villagers never spoke of him again. But deep in the jungle, if one listened closely on a silent night, they could still hear his voice, soft, broken, and forever lost in the forest that eats men whole. Thanks for tuning into African Tales by Kes. If these stories are inspiring you, make sure to hit that like button, share with friends, and subscribe so you never miss out on the magic of African storytelling.